The Galactic Council had watched humanity for 3 long years before they allowed them to join as observers, and in that time they had learned many things about the strange creatures from the blue planet called Earth. Ambassador Kethphile was a being made of living crystal, and his people, the Volanti, could speak through sounds that vibrated like music, and he had been chosen to work with the humans because his species found them interesting in a dangerous sort of way. The council chambers floated in space on a massive station called Meridian, and inside those great halls sat representatives from 47 different species that had learned to travel between the stars, and most of these beings had evolved from creatures that were hunted rather than creatures that did the hunting. The Volanti were made of crystal, and the Chorus Collective were like giant insects that shared one mind, and the Morathi were soft beings that looked like living water, and all of them had survived by being smart and careful rather than strong and violent. There were a few predator species on the council, like the Scarith, who looked like tall lizards with sharp teeth, but even they had learned to control their hunting instincts after thousands of years of building civilization. But the humans were not like any of them. Humans were young, and they had not been in space for very long, and according to every test and scan and study the council had done on them, they were deeply and truly dangerous in ways that made even the Scarith nervous. When something moved near a human, their eyes would track it without thinking, and when they felt threatened, their bodies would fill with chemicals that made them ready to fight, and they had not reached the stars through peace and cooperation, like most species, but through centuries of making war against each other. The scientists who studied alien minds had created a special name for this reaction, and they called it the predator trigger. And it meant that humans could switch from calm and friendly to violent and deadly in the space of a heartbeat. High Counselor Mavin was a being with long glowing tentacles that flickered with light when she felt emotions, and she had spoken about the humans during a private meeting where no humans were allowed to listen. She had said that the humans were useful because their aggression made them good at keeping peace in the dangerous frontier systems where pirates and criminals hid, and she had said that their violence could be pointed at enemies of the council like a weapon, but she had also said that they must be managed and contained and controlled, and that they must never be allowed to truly feel the full power of their predator instincts, because if they did, then no one knew what might happen. The council believed they understood humans, and they thought they knew exactly what made them dangerous, and they had built their entire plan around managing that danger like a fire that could warm you or burn you, depending on how carefully you watched it. Ambassador Kethphile had spent more time with humans than almost any other alien, and he had watched them carefully and learned their ways, and he thought he understood them better than most of his fellow council members. He had seen humans laugh at jokes that made no sense to his crystalline mind, and he had seen them cry over small creatures that died, even though those creatures had no intelligence, and he had seen them risk their own lives to save strangers they had never met before, and he had seen them fight. He had watched recordings of humans in combat during the frontier conflicts, and he had seen the way their eyes went wide and their bodies tensed, and their voices rose to screaming shouts as they charged into danger, and it had terrified him in a way he could not fully explain. But he had also noticed something that the council scientists had missed, and it was something that nagged at him during quiet moments when he had time to think. The humans he had seen fighting were always loud, and they always gave warnings before they attacked, and they always seemed to be struggling against themselves as much as against their enemies, as if part of them did not want to fight, even as another part of them could not stop. He had mentioned this observation to High Counselor Mavin once, and she had dismissed it as unimportant, because the key fact was that humans were violent and dangerous and unpredictable, and that was all the council needed to know to manage them properly. Kethphile had accepted her wisdom at the time, because she was the High Counselor, and she had led the council for many centuries, and she was supposed to know better than a simple ambassador But he had never quite forgotten that observation, and he had never stopped watching the humans for more clues about what they truly were beneath their strange soft skin and their intense forward-facing eyes, the human delegation. To Station Meridian was led by Ambassador Chen Wei, and she was a small woman with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything at once, and Kethfall had worked with her for 2 years, and he had come to respect her intelligence and her dedication to peace. She had a way of speaking that was calm and measured, and she never raised her voice, even when other delegates shouted at her. And she seemed to have perfect control over the famous human emotions that the council feared so much, but sometimes when Kethfall looked at her, he saw something behind her eyes that he could not name, and it made his crystal heart vibrate with a frequency that felt like warning bells ringing in the distance. He had decided that this was simply his own fear of humans affecting his judgment, and he had told himself that Ambassador Chen was exactly what she appeared to be, which was a skilled diplomat who had learned to control her predator instincts through training and discipline. The council had protocols for dealing with humans, and everyone followed them carefully, and the protocols were based on the simple idea that humans were dangerous when they were angry and safe when they were calm, and so the goal was to keep them calm at all times. These protocols had worked well for 3 years, and there had been only a few incidents where humans had become violent, and those incidents had been contained and managed, and everyone had learned from them. The council was confident that they had solved the puzzle of humanity, and that they knew exactly how to handle these strange predators from the blue planet called Earth. They were about to discover how terribly wrong they were on the day that changed everything. The council chambers were full of delegates from all 47 species, and the air was thick with the sounds of a dozen different languages being translated by the station computers, and everything seemed normal and routine. No one knew that in less than 1 hour, their entire understanding of humanity would be shattered forever, and that they would learn a truth about predators that would haunt their nightmares for generations to come. The Kiva ships appeared on the station sensors without warning, and they requested permission to dock and address the council, and no one had any idea what horror they were about to bring through the great doors of the chamber. The Kiva were a species that most council members preferred not to think about too much, and when their ships appeared near Station Meridian, a cold feeling spread through the chamber like ice water flowing through veins. There were 7 of them in the delegation, and their ships were old and ugly compared to the sleek vessels of council species, but no one laughed at them, because everyone knew what the Kiva did and what they were capable of. The Kiva were harvesters, but they did not harvest crops or minerals or anything that could be bought and sold in normal markets, and instead they harvested people, and they had been doing it for longer than most species had been traveling between stars. They moved through the edges of the galaxy, where the council did not watch closely, and they found planets where people had not yet learned to build ships that could fly to other worlds, and they took those people, and no one ever saw them again. What happened to the harvested people was something the council had never investigated too closely, because the Kiva were careful to only take species that were not members of the council, and that meant they were not technically breaking any laws. It was a loophole that many council members felt uncomfortable about, but not uncomfortable enough to actually do anything, because the Kiva were dangerous, and it was easier to look away than to confront them. Their leader was called Overseer Drawl, and he was tall and thin, and he looked like someone had taken a giant insect and stretched it until it was almost the shape of a person, but not quite, in his joints bent in directions that made other species feel sick to look at. When he walked into the council chamber, his feet made clicking sounds on the metal floor, and his eyes, which were too large and too dark, moved constantly, as if he was looking for something to grab and take away. He stopped in the center of the chamber, where all the delegations could see him, and he spread his long arms wide in a gesture that might have been meant to look friendly, but instead looked like a predator showing off how big it was. His voice when he spoke carried a sound that made listeners feel like they were being measured and weighed and judged. And found to be worth taking, he said that the Kiva wished to make their relationship with the council more formal, and that they wanted to be recognized as a legitimate trading partner, and that they had brought a gift to show their good intentions. The word gift made several delegates shift nervously in their seats, because everyone knew that gifts from the Kiva were never simple and never free-draw. Made a gesture, and two of his guards walked forward, and between them they held a small figure that walked with slow mechanical steps as if it had forgotten how to move on its own. It was a human child. She was a girl who looked about 6 years old, with brown hair that hung in tangles around her face and eyes that stared at nothing, as if she had gone somewhere deep inside herself where nothing could reach her around. Her throat was a metal collar that glowed with a faint blue light, and everyone who saw it knew what it was because suppression collars were used on dangerous prisoners to prevent them from fighting back, and seeing one on a child made even the coldest delegates feel something twist inside them. Drow explained that this was a sample of their newest acquisition, and he said that the outer human colonies beyond Council protection had proven very productive, and he thought the Council might appreciate seeing the quality of what the Kiva had to offer. The chamber exploded with noise as delegates from dozens of species shouted and flashed colors and made sounds of outrage, and for a moment it seemed like chaos would consume the entire meeting. But Ambassador Kethvile was not watching the other delegates, because his attention had been caught by something that made his crystal body ring with alarm, like a bell being struck by a hammer. The human delegation had stopped moving. Ambassador Chen Wei had been talking with her aide just a moment before, and she had been gesturing with her hands the way humans did when they were making a point, and her face had been animated and alive. Now she was perfectly still, not still like someone who was surprised or shocked or even angry, because Kethval had seen all of those human reactions, and he knew what they looked like, and this was none of them. This was something different. This was something he had never seen before. All 8 humans in the delegation stood like statues carved from stone, and their eyes were fixed on the child, and their faces showed nothing at all, and the absence of expression was somehow more frightening than any rage could have been. Kethval had studied human biology, and he knew the signs of the predator trigger because the Council had trained him to recognize them, and he knew that when humans became dangerous, their pupils grew large, and their hearts beat faster, and their skin flushed with blood, and their muscles tensed for action. None of those things were happening. The humans were calm in a way that seemed impossible, and their heart rates were actually dropping rather than rising, and their pupils were not dilated but focused like targeting systems locking onto a point in space. The predator trigger was not activating. Something else was happening instead. Raul did not seem to notice because he was too busy enjoying the chaos his gift had created, and he stood in the center of the chamber with what might have been a smile on his strange face as delegates shouted and argued. Around him, High Counselor Mevin was trying to restore order, and her tentacles were flashing rapidly as she called for calm and reminded everyone that the Kiva had not technically violated any Council laws. She turned to Ambassador Chun, and her voice carried the tone of someone giving an order to a subordinate when she said that the human delegation would restrain itself and that the Kiva were operating within legal boundaries. Ambassador Chun did not respond immediately, and when she did speak, her voice was soft and gentle, and it cut through the noise of the chamber like a whisper that somehow everyone could hear. She said that she needed to ask Overseer Drawl a question. The chamber went silent because something in her tone demanded silence in the same way that a deep hole in the ground demands that you do not step forward. Raul clicked his mandibles in what might have been amusement, and he told her to ask her question. Little Predator Chen asked if the colony that this child came from was a place called New Providencia. Confirmed that yes, he believed that was what the locals had called it. Chen said that New Providence had a population of 43,000 people. Rao said that was correct, and he emphasized the past tense in a way that made it clear those people no longer existed as free. Beings Chun nodded slowly, as if she was processing information that was too large to understand all at once, and then she turned to her aide, Lieutenant Commander Torres, and she spoke quietly. She asked him to please take Emma Chun, age 6 daughter of Michael and Sarah Chun, formerly of New Providence, to their medical bay, and to have Dr. Okonkwo remove the collar and begin treatment. She had looked up the child's name and family in the time it took to have one short conversation, and that small detail made Kethval realized that the humans had been doing something behind their still faces and empty expressions. Torres moved toward the child, but the Kiva guard shifted to block his path, and they raised weapons that hummed with energy draws. Voice carried pleasure when he spoke again, and he said that he had been hoping to see the famous Predator Trigger in action, and he asked Ambassador Chun if it frustrated her to know that she could not act and that her council handlers had put her on a leash. Jen did not look at him. She was watching Torres, who had stopped 3 feet away from the guards, and she spoke again in that impossibly quiet voice. She said, "Commander, I gave you an order." Torres nodded once. Then he moved, and in that moment, Ambassador Kethval understood that everything the Council believed about humans was wrong. The Council had seen human combat before in recordings and reports and carefully studied footage from the frontier conflicts, and they thought they knew what it looked like when humans became violent. They expected screaming and rage and wild movements, driven by the famous Predator Trigger that made humans so dangerous and so useful and so terrifying to the prey species that dominated the galactic community. What they saw instead was something that broke their understanding of violence completely. Torres did not make a sound. He did not roar or snarl or shout a battle cry or do any of the things that humans were supposed to do when they attacked, and he simply moved from standing still to being somewhere else, and the transition was so smooth that it looked like a video that had skipped forward. One moment he was 3 feet from the Kiva guards, and the next moment he was on the other side of them, and he was holding Emma Chun in his arms, and the guards were falling to the ground with their joints bent in ways that meant they would never stand again. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. The guards had not even had time to fire their weapons, and the weapons clattered to the floor, still humming with unspent energy, and Torres was already walking toward the exit as if nothing unusual had happened. He was not breathing hard, and his face showed no emotion, and his steps were measured and calm, and he held the child as gently as if she was made of glass. The chamber was completely silent. Even the delegates who had been shouting moments before had stopped making any sound because they were trying to understand what they had just witnessed, and their minds were struggling to fit it into their understanding of what humans were. Overseer Dral stood frozen in place, and his mandibles were clicking rapidly in a pattern that might have been shock or fear or both. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its confident superiority. He said that the council would hear about this and that there would be consequences, and that humanity had just made a powerful enemy ambassador. Chen's voice remained soft and gentle, as if she was discussing the weather or the schedule for tomorrow's meetings, and she said that she was formally requesting a 15-minute recess to consult with her. Government High Counselor Mevin's tentacles had stopped flickering, and she was staring at Chun the way that a small animal stares at something it has just realized is much more dangerous than it first appeared. She granted the recess in a whisper. Human delegation walked out of the chamber in perfect formation, and they moved together like a single organism with many bodies, and not one of them looked back at the Kiva or the fallen guards or the shocked delegates. Kethval watched them go, and he noticed that none of them were speaking to each other, and yet they all seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do and how to move, and it was as if they were communicating through some channel that he could not detect. The recess was supposed to last 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Delegates gathered in small groups and spoke in hushed voices, and everyone was trying to understand what they had just seen. And failing, and the fear in the chamber was thick enough to tasteful, approached High Counselor Mevin, and he asked her what she thought was happening, and her answer made his crystal heart crack with cold. She said that she did not know, and she said it in a voice that had never sounded so uncertain, and she admitted that nothing in the Council's research on humans had predicted this kind of behavior. The predator trigger was supposed to make humans dangerous, but it was also supposed to make them predictable, because anger followed patterns, and patterns could be managed and controlled. What they had just seen was not anger, and it did not follow any pattern that the Council recognized, and that meant that all of their plans for managing humanity were based on incomplete information. Droll demanded that something be done, and his voice was loud and angry, and he pointed at the fallen guards. And he said that this was an act of war, and that the Council was obligated to punish the humans for their violence. Mevin looked at him, and something in her expression made him stop talking, because even he could see that the power in the room had shifted in ways that he did not understand. She said that the Council would discuss the matter after the recess ended, and until then, she suggested that Overseer Droll consider his position very carefully. The 15 minutes passed, and the chamber doors opened. Ambassador Chun walked back in, followed by a man that Kethfall had never seen before. He was tall with gray hair at his temples, and he wore a uniform that marked him as a high-ranking military officer, and he moved through the chamber like a ghost that did not acknowledge the existence of anyone around him. His name was Admiral James Okonkwo, and he had apparently been aboard the human cruiser called Remembrance, which had been holding position near Station Meridian for the past several weeks. The Admiral walked directly to Overseer Droll, and he stopped exactly 3 feet away, and he looked at the Kiva leader with eyes that held absolutely nothing in them. Not anger, and not hatred, and not even disgust, and just a vast empty calm that seemed to go on forever, like the space between stars. He spoke, and his voice was quiet and calm and conversational, as if he was discussing something of mild interest, rather than the fate of 43,000 human beings. He said that he had just received confirmation from Fleet Command, and that new providence's distress signal had been activated 18 days ago, and that it had not been detected by human monitoring systems because someone had changed the colony's protection status without informing humanity. He glanced at High Counselor Mevin when he said the word someone, and the implication was clear. Mevin's tentacles flickered rapidly, and she started to say that the Kiva had assured the Council that they would only operate in certain areas, but the Admiral interrupted her. He said that he did not care what the Kiva had assured, and his voice did not rise when he said it, and that lack of volume was somehow more frightening than any shout could have been. He turned back to Droll, and he listed the facts in a voice that was almost gentle. And he said 43,000 human beings, and he said men and women and children, and he said gone and taken, and he asked what purpose this served. Droll had recovered some of his confidence, and he said that humanity had no right to question Kiva practices, and that the Council recognized their operations as legal. The Admiral nodded as if this was the answer he had expected, and then he said something that changed everything. He said that the Council had made a mistake, and he said that they had assumed human aggression was humanity's most dangerous trait, and he said that they had built their entire strategy around managing human anger. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression that Kethfile had ever seen, because it contained no anger at all and only a vast cold patience. He said that the Council had never considered what happened when humans stopped being angry. Mevin asked what that was, and her voice was barely audible. The Admiral said one word. He said focus, and in that moment, Kethfall understood that the galaxy was about to learn a truth about predators that would haunt them forever. Admiral Okonkwo stood in the center of the Council chamber, and every eye in the room was fixed on him, and the silence was so complete that delegates could hear their own hearts beating. He looked at Overseer Drawl, and he continued speaking in that quiet, calm voice that carried no emotion and no heat, and only a terrible, endless patience. He said that when humans get angry, they make mistakes, and he said that they act without thinking, and they do things they later regret, and their famous predator trigger is actually a weakness rather than a strength. He said that anger makes humans predictable, and that the Council had been right to build their management strategies around human anger because angry humans follow patterns, and patterns can be anticipated. And Controller Draw's mandibles clicked, and he seemed to be trying to find something to say. But the Admiral was not finished speaking. He said that when you take human children, and when you cross the lines that humans do not even need to speak out loud because everyone understands them, then something else happens. He said that the anger burns away like fuel being consumed by fire, and what remains afterward is very, very quiet. He stepped closer to Drawl, and the Kiva leader did not step back, but something in his posture changed, and there was a quality to his stillness that looked like recognition, or perhaps like fear. Admiral said that he was not threatening Drawl, because threats are what angry people make to try to change behavior, and he said that he was simply explaining what was about to happen. Turned to address the entire chamber, and his voice carried to every corner and every delegation, and his words fell like stones into still water. He said that 47 hours ago, the combined military forces of Earth had received confirmation of what had happened to New Providence, and he said that in the time since then humanity had been quiet. He paused, and the pause stretched out, and delegates found themselves leaning forward, as if pulled by invisible strings. He said that in that quiet humanity had been very, very busy. He raised his hand, and a holographic display appeared at the center of the chamber, and it showed a dark planet orbiting a dying red star, and the planet was labeled in human script that the translators rendered as Kiva Prime. He said, "This is your homeworld, Overseer," and he gestured, and the display expanded to show 12 more planets scattered across the nearby space. And he said, "These are the colony worlds of the Kiva Dominion." Then red dots began appearing on the display, and they multiplied and spread until there were hundreds of them positioned throughout Kiva space, and each dot pulsed with slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The Admiral said that these were the positions of 247 human warships that were currently holding what he called silent running positions within Kiva territory. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates scrambled from their seats, and translators overloaded with the volume of voices and species that had not shown strong emotion in centuries were suddenly shouting and flashing and vibrating with shock, and Farkathval stood frozen in place, and his crystal body was ringing with frequencies he had never experienced before, and his mind was trying to calculate the implications of what he had just heard. 247 warships in Kiva space positioned around their homeworld and their colonies, and no one had detected them. The Kiva had monitoring systems and patrol fleets and warning networks and all of the things that any spacefaring species used to protect their territory, and none of them had noticed almost 250 human warships moving into attack positions. That should have been impossible. But the Admiral was not lying, because humans were terrible liars, and Kethval had learned to read their expressions well enough to know when they were being truthful, and the Admiral's face showed nothing but calm, honest certainty. The chaos continued for several minutes, and High Counselor Mevin's tentacles were flashing in desperate patterns as she tried to restore order, and finally the noise began to die down as delegates exhausted themselves. Drawl spoke first, and his voice was no longer confident and no longer amused, and it carried a note that sounded almost like pleading. He said that the humans would not attack, and that the Council would never permit such aggression, and that there would be consequences that humanity could not afford. The Admiral nodded slowly, as if he was considering this argument seriously. Then he said that the Council had no authority over what humanity did in Kiva space, and he pointed out that Draal had personally ensured this by making certain that Kiva operations always happened beyond Council jurisdiction. He said that humanity had learned from the Kiva example, and his voice was almost gentle when he said it, as if he was explaining something to a child who had made a mistake and was only now realizing it. Draal's mandibles were clicking so rapidly that the sound was almost continuous, and his large dark eyes were moving between the Admiral and the holographic display and back again, as if he was looking for some escape that did not exist. High Counselor Mevin stepped forward, and her tentacles had stopped flickering, and she spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled but carried undertones of barely contained panic. She asked what humanity wanted, and she asked what it would take to make those red dots on the display disappear. The Admiral turned to look at her, and for the first time something like emotion flickered across his face, and it was not anger or satisfaction, but something that looked almost like disappointment. Said that was an interesting question, and he said that it was interesting because Mevin was asking what humanity wanted rather than asking what was right. He said that 47 hours ago, humanity had stopped being angry about New Providence, and he said that in that quiet they had moved ships and planned operations and prepared for every possible outcome. He said that they had done all of this without sending a single message that could be intercepted, and without making a single move that could be detected, and without giving a single warning to anyone. He looked around the chamber at all the delegates who were staring at him with expressions of fear and awe and confusion. He said that the Council should think about what that meant, and he said that for 47 hours, humanity had been completely silent, and in that silence they had positioned themselves to destroy an entire civilization without anyone knowing until it was already too late. He said that this time it was the Kiva who had crossed the line, and this time it was Kiva space that was full of human warships. Then he asked what the Council thought would happen if humanity ever went quiet about them. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Kethful had ever heard, and somewhere in the back of his mind a voice that might have been wisdom or might have been terror whispered that the galaxy would never be the same again. The negotiations lasted 6 hours, and when they finally ended, the chamber smelled like fear and exhaustion, and something else that Kethfal could only describe as the death of assumptions. The terms that were agreed upon were unlike anything the past Council had ever witnessed, because they were not really negotiations at all, but rather a careful explanation of what was going to happen, followed by acceptance from the side that had no choice. The Kiva Dominion would immediately release all surviving human captives from New Providence, and the number was 4,847 individuals, which was less than 12% of the original population of 43,000. The other 88% were gone, and the Kiva provided documentation of what had happened to them, and that documentation was sealed and classified, and Kethfile never learned what it contained, but he saw the faces of the human delegation when they read it, and he never wanted to know. Kiva would pay reparations to every surviving family, and the amount was calculated using formulas that the humans provided, and that Kiva did not argue about the numbers, because they understood that arguing was no longer an option. The Kiva would submit to permanent human monitoring of their activities throughout the galaxy, and human observers would be placed on every Kiva ship, and every Kiva station, and every Kiva planet, and they would watch and record and report, and there was nothing the Kiva could do about it. In exchange, the 247 human warships would withdraw from Kiva space, and that was all, and there were no other concessions, because the humans did not need to give anything else. Overseer Draal signed the agreement with hands that trembled slightly, and his mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, as if some essential part of him had broken. During the past 6 hours, he left the chamber without looking back, and his remaining guards followed him, and none of them made any sound as they walked to their ships and departed from Station Mariniankatho watched them go. and he felt something that might have been pity, but mostly he felt relief that the crisis was over. But the crisis was not really over, because something had changed in the galaxy that could never be unchanged. And everyone in the chamber knew it, even if they did not want to admit it. High Counselor Mevin approached Ambassador Chen as the last of the Kiva delegation, disappeared through the doors, and her tentacles were moving in patterns that suggested deep uncertainty and perhaps the beginning of a new understanding. She said that the council had miscalculated, and she admitted that they had believed they understood humanity, and that this belief had been wrong. Chen's expression had not changed throughout the entire 6 hours of negotiations, and it still showed nothing but calm patience as she listened to the High Counselor speak. Maven said that the council had understood human anger, and that they had built their entire relationship with humanity around managing that anger and preventing it from causing damage. Chen nodded slightly and said that this was true, and her voice was still soft and gentle, as if she was discussing something of only mild importance. Maven asked about the silence, and her voice carried genuine curiosity beneath the fear, and she wanted to understand what had happened, because understanding was the only way to feel safe. Chen was quiet for a moment, as if she was considering how to explain something that should have been obvious, but somehow was not. Then she asked if the High Counselor knew why predators roared and growled and made so much noise when they were hunting. Maven's tentacles flickered negative. Chen said that loud noises were warnings, and that they gave prey a chance to escape, and that even at their most aggressive, humans were offering their enemies an opportunity to surrender or run or make things right. She said that human anger was actually a gift because it told everyone around them that something was wrong, and that there was still time to fix it. Maven whispered that she thought the silence meant that humans had stopped trying to scare their enemies and had started trying to kill them. Chen shook her head slowly. She said that the silence meant something different, and she said it meant that humans had already decided, and that the hunt was over, and the only thing remaining was the execution of a plan that had been made in perfect cold clarity. She said that this was what the Kiva had never understood, and what the Council had never understood, and what most species never understood about predators who had evolved to hunt other intelligent beings. She said that human anger was humanity's way of giving others a chance to avoid what was coming, and the silence was humanity's way of saying that the chance had passed. Maven asked how long humans had been quiet before the warships were in position, and her voice was barely audible. Chen said 47 hours. Maven asked what humans could do in 47 days, and Chen did not answer, but something in her expression made it clear that the answer was terrifying. Maven asked what humans could do in 47 months or 47 years, and Chen still did not answer, and the silence stretched out until it became an answer in itself. Chen turned to leave, and she stopped and looked back at the High Counselor one more time. She said that the Council should update its threat assessment protocols, and she suggested creating a new category, and she said it should be called the Silence Before, and it should be marked as the highest threat level that existed. Maven asked if this was higher than the Predator. Trigger Jin's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly. She said that the Predator trigger meant humans were still fighting against themselves and still struggling with their instincts and still human in the way that other species understood. She said that the silence meant that the struggle was over and that every part of a human being had aligned toward a single purpose, and nothing would stop them until that purpose was fulfilled. Then she walked away. Kithval approached Mevin, and he asked if she was functioning properly, because her tentacles had stopped moving entirely, and her bioluminescence had faded to almost nothing. Maven was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a frequency that Kethval had never heard from her before. It was terror. She said that the Council had spent years trying to prevent humans from getting angry, and she said that they had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes because the humans had stopped getting angry entirely, She said that instead of rage, they've found focus, and instead of heat, they had found cold, and instead of noise, they had found silence. She said that the council had been so afraid of the fire that they had never considered what would happen when the fire went out and left behind only darkness. Gethavel did not know what to say, and so he said nothing. He watched as Ambassador Chun walked across the chamber toward the medical bay where little Emma Chun was being treated, and he saw Admiral Okonkwo walking beside her. The child was awake now, and she was standing between them, and she reached up and took both of their hands, and they walked together toward the exit. For the first time since the Kiva had arrived, Emma Chun smiled, and it was a small, fragile smile, but it was real, and it meant that somewhere deep inside her the damage was beginning to help. Kethfall watched them go, and he realized that this was why humanity had gone silent. Not for revenge, and not for power, and not for territory or resources, or any of the things that other species fought over. They had gone silent for a child, and that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant that humanity would never stop, and never give up, and never back down when someone hurt the ones they loved. The galaxy had learned a new truth about predators that day, and the truth was simple and terrible. When a human is yelling at you, there is still hope, because the anger means they still care enough to give you a chance. But when a human goes quiet, you should pray to whatever gods you believe in, because the silence means the chance is gone, and what comes next is as inevitable as gravity and as unstoppable as time. In the years that followed, the phrase human silence became the most feared term in galactic diplomacy, and species that had never feared anything learned to watch human faces for signs of that terrible calm. The Kiva never harvested another sentient species, and they faded into obscurity and eventually disappeared from galactic records entirely. The Council never again tried to manage or control or contain humanity, and instead, they simply tried to understand them and to never ever give them a reason to go quiet. And Ambassador Kethfile spent the rest of his long life telling anyone who would listen about the day he learned what human silence meant. He would tell them that there was a moment in every predator's hunt when the chase ended and the kill began, and for most predators, that moment was marked by noise and fury and chaos. But for humans, that moment was marked by perfect stillness. And if you ever saw that stillness, you were already too late, because the silence meant the decision had been made and nothing in the galaxy could unmake it. This was the lesson the Council learned that day, and they never forgot it, and neither did anyone else.